Hi friends, happy March. The passage of time is terrifying and February just absolutely flew by, but that means that it is time for a February wrap up. February was a solid month. I feel like 2025 has been a solid reading year so far. I found 2 new favorites this month. I DNF'd 2 books, and overall I just got to some books that I was really excited to read, so I'm happy with how it went. Let's talk about my Storygraph stats before we get into the books. I read 10 books for a total of 1,913 pages. They were 70% fiction and 30% nonfiction. And 6 of them were books that I owned, 2 were ARCs, 1 was from NetGalley, and 1 was an ebook from Everand. So yeah, it was a really literary fiction heavy month. We did have an essay collection that's a new release, some poetry, which is kind of different for me, and 2 books that just got longlisted for the International Booker Prize. So that was kind of a fun coincidence since they just announced the long list. So yeah, if that is your thing as well, you should definitely stick around and subscribe. I post videos every Saturday morning. I started February out strong with a book from the Queen, Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye. This was a 5-star read for me, and I had been looking forward to reading this book for almost an entire year since the last Toni Morrison book that I read in 2024. It is so insane to me that this was her debut novel. She just never fails to craft such a harrowing story. I mean, my jaw was on the floor by page 5 of this book. She uses the Dick and Jane story as a framework, kind of that old-timey 1950s, I want to say is the vibe that it's giving me, like Dick and Jane and their parents. You guys might know what I'm talking about. I feel like I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but she uses that as a way to frame the story of our main character, Pekala. Pekala is an 11-year-old Black girl who is really ostracized by her community. She has a really tumultuous family life, and she prays every night to have blue eyes because she thinks that that will make her beautiful and make her accepted. I think using that Dick and Jane framework in contrast to Pekala and her family was a really genius way to kind of set the tone of the story. This novel is such a haunting exploration of race, class, and gender, and the way that all of those things intersect, as well as the effect of beauty standards on society. All of these things keep happening to Pekala, and I think the book really just goes to show the limits of what a person can take. Morrison talks about this in the introduction to the book, and I thought that she just did it in such an affecting way. She's also exploring family history. We get a lot of kind of backstory about Pekala's parents, and we see how the things that happen in their lives kind of echo and have an effect on Pekala. As always, the writing is just so beautiful and descriptive and evocative, and I really like the way that Morrison sets the scene of this book. It simultaneously has a small town feel while also being very much affected by real world, large-scale societal issues. It creates a lot of tension and it just feels so expansive. As I always say whenever I talk about Morrison, I feel like my reviews just can never do her justice. She's one of those authors that you just have to read for yourself, and I think if you haven't read her yet, I think it would be really cool to read her in chronological order. Start here and then go in publication order. I don't think that you could go wrong with that. So yeah, 5 stars, love Morrison. Almost all of her books that I've read so far have been 5-star reads for me. And it ended up working out really well that The Bluest Eye was the Morrison that I'd been planning on reading next, because it coincided with the release of Bibliophobia by Chihaya. Random House sent me this book as well as a little tote bag, which is incredible, so thank you to them for that. This published in February. I forget what the exact date was, but it is out now to purchase. Speaking of purchasing, I am a bookshop.org affiliate. If you are interested in any of the books that I talk about here, They'll all be in a list that's linked in the description of the video, and I make a little bit of money if you buy a book from there. Anyways, this was a 4-star read for me. This was my most anticipated release of 2025 thus far. It is everything that I love in a book. It's a combination of memoir, connected essays, and literary criticism, so it was right up my alley. And in this book, Sarah Chihaya is exploring the relationship that book-obsessed people have with the books that have impacted their lives, and she looks at this through the lens of the life ruiner. And for Sarah, her life ruiner was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. She read it when she was in high school and helped her to understand the complicated feelings that she had as a Japanese American growing up in the predominantly white suburbs in Ohio. She also recounts her difficulties with mental illness and the way that that led her to go on a quest to find a book that would save her from herself. I really loved Sarah Chihaya's style and tone. It made it really easy to just fly through the pages of this book. Her deep connection to both reading and writing is so palpable in the pages of this book, and you can really tell that she's done a lot of self-reflection on the ways that books have impacted her life, both positively and negatively. I think at the heart of this book, there is a lot of negative impact that has come about because of her obsession with literature, and I feel like that's not something that I've seen explored at all. Usually there's such a reverence and just like this positive connotation with reading and with books, but we see the ways in which it really did affect her in a not so great way. I also thought that the group of books that she was talking about in this collection was super interesting. There is like a list of texts that are mentioned in the beginning of this book, so you do get a nice little reading list. She did 2 really impossible things for me, one of which being she made me reconsider my decision to take a break from reading Ali Smith's books. She talks about Artful in this book, and I thought that that sounded really intriguing, and I am considering picking it up from the library, even though I haven't loved all of the Ali Smith books that I've read so far. She also made me think differently about The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt, which I read a couple years ago, and pretty sure I crowned that as my least favorite book of all time in a Q&A a couple months ago. She had a really deep connection to that book, and it was really cool to kind of get her thoughts on it since it is such a beloved book of hers. And yeah, it just made me see things a little bit differently. I don't think that it's a book that I will ever reread, but I liked hearing her perspective on it. She also talks about a lot of books that have been on my TBR for a while, so that was nice to kind of get a feel for some of those. And I'm also really glad that I decided to read The Bluest Eye right before I picked this up. I think that it made me appreciate both of these books so much more than I would have if I had read them separately. I did find that I had a little bit of trouble sometimes following the timeline of events in Sarah Chihaya's life. I feel like we jumped around a little bit, and that made it a little bit difficult for me to find my footing in some sections of the book. And I also feel like there was something in her tone, even though it was pretty like conversational, there's something that just made her feel a little bit distant as a narrator. Even though the subject matter is so personal, I feel like there was kind of this like wall in between me as a reader and her as a writer that just, I don't know, like I still haven't fully figured out why that was for me, but that did kind of detract from my reading experience a little bit. I thought this was really enjoyable and really thought-provoking. It just wasn't quite the 5-star book that I was expecting it to be whenever I was anticipating its release. I'd be really interested to reread this at some point, and I'm also really excited to see what Sarah Chihaya does in the future. I think if you're a book lover, if you're a big reader, you should definitely check this out. Next was my NetGalley book that I read this month, and that was The Echoes by Evie Wyld. Thank you to Knopf and NetGalley for the early copy of that. It released on February 18th, so this is also out. I actually just saw some copies of it at a bookstore yesterday, so that was cool to see. This was a 4-star read for me. I wasn't expecting to enjoy this one quite as much as I did. I got really sucked into this book and ended up reading the majority of it over the course of one day. It's part family history, part ghost story, part autopsy of a relationship. There are a lot of moving parts in the book, but I think that they all really do end up working together to create a really compelling read. We start out following Max, who is a recently deceased writer. He is a ghost and is stuck in the apartment that he shared with his longtime girlfriend, Hannah. A lot of Hannah's family life has been a mystery to Max. So we get chapters that alternate between Max's perspective as a ghost, kind of watching her deal with her grief after he passes away. We also get chapters from Hannah's perspective before Max passed away, and we get a little bit more of some insight into things that she was going through and her thoughts and feelings on their relationship. And then we also get a chapter from each of Hannah's family members from her childhood, talking about some events that took place when Hannah was a kid. So it sounds like a lot. There's a lot going on, but I think once you kind of find your groove with it and settle into it, it makes for a really compelling way to move through the story. You're kind of puzzling the pieces together of Hannah's life. I did think that the family dynamics and the events that occurred in Hannah's childhood were the most compelling part of the story. It felt like Max's role in Hannah's life and the plotline dealing with their relationship just wasn't quite as fleshed out as the family stuff was. And Max just felt like a bit of a weaker character compared to Hannah and the rest of her family. I was a little bit unsure of the ghost story element going into this, but even though it was the weaker plotline, I do think that that was a really effective element at showing the distance between Hannah and Max. I thought that it really effectively demonstrated the concept that you can never fully know somebody. And yeah, I did really enjoy that aspect of the story. There are a lot of heavy topics dealt with in this book, so just beware of that if you decide to pick it up. One of the big things that is discussed in here is the stolen generation survivors of Australia and the way that Hannah's family was living on stolen land when she was a child. That was my first time reading about that topic, and I did some research into it, but I would love to get other people's opinions on how that aspect of the story was handled, just because it's not really something that I feel like I can speak on. I think if you're into a kind of family saga, you will really enjoy this. After that, I read The Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante on Scribd on my e-reader. This was a 4-star read for me as well. This is a pretty short book, but I had to sit with it for a while to figure out how I felt about it. It's one of those books that I feel like I have really hyped up in my own mind just from seeing people talk about it online, seeing all the Elena Ferrante love, and I don't know that it quite met my expectations. I don't know if it was just an issue with my reading experience of it or what, but something about this one did not fully click for me. I feel like it took me way longer to read this book than it should have. It's a really slim novel. I think it's under 200 pages, and yeah, I just didn't feel fully immersed in the story until like around the second half of the book. Things start to pick up the pace a little bit, and it felt a little bit more propulsive to me. But if you don't know, this book follows Olga. She's a mother of 2, and her husband recently left her for a younger woman. This book is set in the hot and steamy Italian summer, and we watch Olga's life unravel over the course of the summer as she is dealing with the aftermath of her husband leaving. Ferrante is digging into desire and jealousy, the grief and the rage that come along with the end of a relationship, and gendered parental expectations. As we kind of got further along in the book and realized just how unwell Olga is, I thought that the stakes became so much higher, and that made me feel a lot more engaged with the book than the first half did. Ferrante is really great at creating this encroaching sense of doom and just this overall instability within the characters that made it really difficult for me to kind of predict how the book was going to end. I think that the themes and the writing style were just classic ferrante, very cutting prose, and she just really lays it all out on the table, all of these like difficult emotions that Olga is dealing with. I think there might have been some weird bumps in the road with the translation. Some of the phrasing sometimes felt a little bit off to me, but maybe that was just a me problem, I don't know. But yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about after I finished this book is that maybe I would have had a better experience reading it physically instead of digitally. So I would be interested to pick up a physical copy of it and reread it eventually. I'm going to keep my eye out at the used bookstore and see if I can get my hands on one for later on. I thought it was a good book, but it just wasn't quite fitting in with like the expectation that I had for my enjoyment of it. After that, I read another 5-star book, and this is one of the books that is longlisted for the International Booker Prize. That is On the Calculation of Volume by Solvej. This was my favorite book of the month. Bluest was my other 5-star read, but I think that this takes the cake for me this month. So this is the first in a 7-book series, which is not really something that I typically go for. Definitely did not have that on my bingo card for this year, but I'm so glad that I picked this up. The second book is also out in English, and I believe the third and the fourth books are being released in November in English. So we've got a lot to look forward to with this series. I believe that the author is still writing these in the original Danish, so I think that we'll have some time before we get to 5, 6, and 7. But yeah, this sucked me in immediately, and I'm going to make a comparison here. I think that if you are a fan of I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, you should definitely check out this book. They both feel similarly haunting with these unexplainable circumstances. They're kind of sci-fi adjacent without getting too much into the sci-fi of it all. And they're also both so beautifully written. And both of these books explore the urge that we have to document our experiences, even if that documentation is only for ourselves. As well as the comfort that writing can bring. So yeah, I just want to kind of put those two books in a little pairing together because I Who Have Never Known Men was a 5-star read for me in January, and yeah, I just feel like they go together. So this book is following Tara Selter. She is a bookseller who finds herself repeating the day of November 18th for an entire year straight. She's aware that this is going on and that this day just keeps repeating, but nobody around her is. They are all living this day as if it is the first time, every time. We see her kind of grappling with explaining to her husband what is going on over and over, and she eventually decides to live on her own. He always believes her whenever she is explaining to him what is going on, but his memory basically wipes at the end of each of the days, and she just kind of can't take having to repeatedly explain herself, and it gets more difficult, more time-consuming as the days continue to repeat. So yeah, she goes and lives on her own and is just trying to figure out how this happened, how she can get out of it. There are so many different things that are explored just in this first volume, and it is pretty short. So I can't wait to see where she goes with this. The book is talking about loneliness, love, the mundanity of the everyday, memory, time, history, the will to survive. Writing, like I talked about earlier with I Who Have Never Known Men. I could even see this series eventually getting into some deeper commentary on consumption and climate change, because our narrator is consuming food, but it doesn't regenerate if she consumes it. So she's seeing things depleting off of the shelves at the grocery store as the days keep piling up. And since it's the same day over and over again, she doesn't really have a way of producing more food. I really loved the writing style of this. It was very straightforward, which is what I like, and I think the translation of this was great. I need everyone to read this book. I wrote in my review that I was hoping that it made the International Booker long list, and it did. So yeah, I am interested in checking out a lot of the books on that long list. I made a video last week reacting to all of those books, but this one is a very strong hopeful for me to win. I do have a couple quotes from this book as well, just to give you kind of a taste of the writing style. I've got 3. The first one is, "That is why I began to write, because I can hear him in the house, because time has fallen apart, because I found a ream of paper on the shelf, because I'm trying to remember, because the paper remembers, and there may be healing in sentences." The second one is, "It seems so odd to me now how one can be so unsettled by the improbable, when we know that our entire existence is founded on freak occurrences and improbable coincidences, that we wouldn't be here at all if it weren't for these curious twists of fate." And the last one is, "I have not found a way out of the 18th of November, but have found roads and paths through the day, narrow passages and tunnels I can move along. I cannot get out, but I can find ways in." Love. Love, love, love. Next up, we have The Life of the Mind by Christine Smallwood. I'm obsessed with this cover. It's kind of giving the Rachel Cusk editions. I rated this 3.75 stars, which I think is kind of a silly rating, but I think that it was applicable for this book. This has been on my TBR shelf for quite a long time, and I found that this ended up actually being quite a quick read. I was really entertained by it while I was reading it, but I'm not sure how much this will stick with me as time passes. So The Life of the Mind is exactly what the title sounds like. We are following the life of our narrator. Her name is Dorothy. She's an adjunct professor, and her academic career is kind of flailing. She's not finding much success. A lot of the thoughts and the experiences that she has throughout the course of the book are centering around the miscarriage that she had recently, and she is keeping that a secret from almost everyone in her life besides her long-term boyfriend. So we get a lot of her like bodily experiences. So if you're squeamish about that, might not be the book for you. That aspect of it kind of reminded me of Practice by Rosalind Brown, which was released last year. I think the very like visceral bodily experiences in that kind of academic setting made those books very similar to each other. I feel like this is just like a classic woman on the edge, no plot, just vibes kind of book. So if that's your thing, you'll probably enjoy this, but I don't think that it did anything super groundbreaking. I really liked Christine Smallwood's writing style. I thought that she did a really good job of incorporating humor with these heavier topics that she's talking about. And a lot of Dorothy's observations felt poignant and relatable. It was really readable, but I just don't think that there was a ton to kind of hold on to in the story. So I don't think that it is going to like stand the test of time for me, hence the 3.75 stars. I do have a quote from this that felt very relevant to like a lot of the things that we're seeing with climate change and like the fires and everything. This book, I think, when was this published? 2021? Yeah, 2021. So kind of, you know, at the tail end of the first Trump era. And I feel like a lot of the things that she talks about are kind of coming back up again, but this quote felt very relevant. It says, "What a strange and old-fashioned collective experience," she said, "the idea that people could all die together in one heaven-bound moment. Today, you had to first watch other people, some of whom lived very far away, and others of whom were technically neighbors, die online, and you couldn't save them. And all the while, you could be next." After that, I had a weekend of some tiny little books. So my reviews for these are not super long, so we're gonna just kind of fly through these. The first one was Bright Dead Things by Ada Limon. This is a poetry collection, and I rated it 3 stars. One of my goals for this year is to get through the poetry collections that I have had sitting on my bookshelf forever, and this is one of them. I don't feel super adept at really reviewing poetry, just because I'm still so new to it, but I thought that this was nice. It was split into 4 different sections. Each of the sections had kind of a loose theme, and there's this kind of style that she does in here. I don't know what the technical term for it is in like poetry world. I, in my review, called it a paragraph poem, but some of her poems are just kind of these sections of just like a paragraph. And I really liked that style specifically, and that happens pretty often in here. I think some of the metaphors and the imagery went over my head a little bit, but there were some really beautiful lines in here. So yeah, poetry, guys, we're trying. After that, I read Hunchback by Saou Ichikawa. This is coming out from Hogarth on March 18th. So thank you to them for the arc of this book. I rated this 4 stars. This was the other book that I read this month that was longlisted for the International Booker. So fun stuff. I feel like I'm ahead of the curve a little bit with that. I think this book is definitely best read in one sitting. I was at the coffee shop with my friend Claire yesterday, and she brought this with her to read, and she probably could have finished it in one sitting if I hadn't kept interrupting her reading to talk to her about random things. But yeah, I would say that this is like a good read it in a morning, which is what I did, or read it in an afternoon and just like do the whole thing at once. The ending of this book made me go, what? It definitely kind of flipped the whole story on its head, and it threw me for a loop. But I think this is a really wry look at disability and class and reproductive rights, and I just don't think that I've ever read a book like this one. I think maybe the closest that I've seen to this is Breasts and Eggs by Miko Kawakami, which is like 4 times the length of this, but it does talk a lot about reproductive rights in Japan specifically. So I think if you enjoyed that, you would probably get something out of this. I really appreciate what the author is able to do in so few pages. This is, I think, 90 pages in total, and she asks a lot of big questions within this book. I think she was also really good at incorporating some humor to kind of balance out the dark topics that are brought up. I'd really love to kind of see the ideas that she is exploring here fleshed out in a longer work. Other than that, I thought the translation of this was really good. Polly Barton. Polly Barton is the translator of this. I've read, I think, 1 other book, maybe 2, translated by her, and I think that she does a really great job. So yeah, this one was pretty good. I would be really interested in hearing other people's thoughts on this one whenever it comes out. After that, to kind of round out my tiny book weekend that I had, I read I Will Write to Avenge My People by Annie Ernaux. This was a 4-star book for me. This was the speech that Ernaux gave when she won the 2022 Nobel Prize. And I believe that it has kind of like, let's see here. It's so short, you guys. Like it's a pamphlet. It's not it's not a substantial book, but it has the opening address that was delivered during the ceremony, Ernaux's Nobel lecture, her banquet speech, and then a presentation speech. So just kind of like a rundown of that ceremony, I guess. I didn't really write much of an actual review for this. The thing that really struck me about this book is the way that Ernaux describes the things that I love about her writing. I feel like she kind of hits the nail on the head way better than I ever could talking about her work. So I do have a couple of quotes that I just kind of used as my review. And these feel very representative of the reasons why I love Ernaux. She says, starting with my 4th book, I adopted a neutral, objective kind of writing, flat in the sense that it contained neither metaphors nor signs of emotion. The violence was no longer displayed. It came from the facts themselves and not the writing. Finding the words that contain both reality and the sensation provided by reality would become, and remain to this day, my ongoing concern in writing, no matter what the subject. And then, the prerequisite of sensation has for me become both the guide and guarantee of the authenticity of my research. But to what end? Not to tell the story of my life, nor free myself of its secrets, but to decipher a lived situation, an event, a romantic relationship, and thereby reveal something that only writing can bring into being and perhaps pass on to the consciousness and memories of others. Who could say that love, pain, and mourning, shame are not universal? And then This commitment through which I pledge myself in writing is supported by the belief, which has become a certainty, that a book can contribute to change in private life, help to shatter the loneliness of experience endured and repressed, and enable beings to reimagine themselves. When the unspeakable is brought to light, it is political. I'm sure that she did a much better job of delivering those lines than I just did, but yeah, it just really made me appreciate her writing and think about why I love her books so much. So not something that I think you need to go out and purchase immediately, because like it's so flimsy. But if you're into ernaux like I am, you know, it's fun to be a completionist. My final finished book for the month, which I actually technically finished in March. I finished it at like 1 a.m. on March 1st, but the majority of it was read in February, so I'm just going to talk about it now. That is The Passion According to GH by Clarice Lispector. I tried to read this last spring and I DNF'd it, soft DNF'd it, because it just wasn't clicking with me, and I was like, let me come back to it later and hopefully have a better time with it. Unfortunately, this did not really do it for me. I rated this 3 stars, and it's definitely on the lower end of my Clarice Lispector ranking of all of the books that I've read of hers so far. I think my ranking of Clarice Lispector books goes An Apprenticeship or The Book of Pleasures, my absolute favorite, honestly might be my favorite book of all time. Then Agua Viva, then Near to the Wild Heart, then The Hour of the Star, then this one, and then The Chandelier. I think those are all the books of hers that I've read. Yeah, that's my ranking thus far. I still have a handful more books to read from her, but yeah, this one was not my favorite, unfortunately. I feel like I've seen so many people talk about how much they love this, and I thought that I would love it too, but I didn't. One of the things that I've talked a lot about in my reviews of other Clarice books is that they work best when you kind of let go of the idea that you need to understand every single thing that she's saying in her books. She just has such an interesting way of writing, and I think being translated from the Portuguese has something to do with that as well. She just has a really unconventional style, and if you're hell-bent on like fully comprehending everything that she's saying, you're not going to have a good time, I don't think. But while that has been fine for me with her other books, there was just a little bit too much in here that I could not make sense of, unfortunately, which is kind of ironic because a lot of what she's talking about in this book is not understanding or understanding things. And I just didn't understand a lot of it. Our narrator is a sculptress named GH, and she encounters a cockroach in her wardrobe, and that sets her off on this philosophical spiral, pretty much. She is going into like the meaning of life and what makes us human, and yeah, there were some passages that when they hit, you know, like when it was relatable and beautifully written, I was like, okay, I'm into this. But unfortunately, there was just a lot of like sifting through to try and find those types of passages. I also thought that the first half of the book was stronger than the second half for me personally. Yeah, I am sad that I didn't love this one. I'm not sure what I'm missing. If you guys have read this and enjoyed it, like, what did I miss? Because like I can't figure it out. I don't know. I do have a quote for this one though, because like I said, when Clarice hits, she hits, and I always really appreciate that about her. So the quote says, "But I'm afraid of newness, and I'm afraid of living whatever I don't understand. I always want to be sure to at least think I understand. I don't know how to give myself over to disorientation. How can I explain that my greatest fear is precisely of being, and yet there is no other way? How can I explain that my greatest fear is living whatever comes? How to explain that I can't stand seeing just because life isn't what I thought, but something else, as if I knew what? Why is seeing such disorganization?" Okay, I feel like I've been talking forever, but I do have 2 books that I DNF'd. One was a soft DNF that I think I'll come back to eventually. The other one, I'm thinking that it's a book that I'm gonna get rid of without returning to it. The first one is the Diary of Anais Volume 1. This is the soft DNF. I started it as my little like before bed light reading and just wasn't feeling compelled to pick it up. I just wasn't in the mood for it. So I think that I will come back to this eventually. I got not very far. I was like 26 or 27 pages in, but I just didn't feel like I wanted to read it. So we're gonna come back to it later. And after I put that one down, I decided to pick up Bad Behavior by Mary Gaitskill as my little before bed short story collection. I read 2 of the stories in this book and was just not into it. And I read some reviews of it, and it seems like the rest of the stories are all gonna be kind of a similar thing. Very like toxic relationships, some like sadistic sexual things going on, a lot of like drug use and stuff, and it just wasn't something that I really wanted to read about. So I think I'm gonna get rid of this. Sorry to the person that commented and said that they were reading this and loving it. That was why I picked this up, but yeah, it just wasn't working for me, and I just am not a huge short story person in general, so that could also be part of my issue with it. All right, that is everything for February. I feel like I got to some books that have really been kind of haunting me for a little bit and have been just lingering on my shelves, and some books by some authors that I typically really love. So yeah, I'm happy with that. Happy that I am getting more comfortable with DNFing books and putting them aside if they're not working for me. And yeah, let me know what you read in February. What was your favorite book of the month? And that's all I've got. So I will talk to you guys next week. Bye.